Before the world knew his name, he was just a tired father in faded work boots, mocked by millionaires and humiliated by an undefeated champion. But the elite forgot one crucial rule: never corner a quiet man who has nothing left to lose and a daughter to protect. David Cole was a ghost in his own life. At 36, the deep lines around his eyes and the permanent grease under his fingernails told the story of a man who had traded his youth for survival. He worked 2 jobs to keep the heat on in his cramped 1-bedroom apartment in South Seattle, a daytime mechanic at a struggling auto shop, and a night shift maintenance man at the Apex Summit, the city's most exclusive ultra-luxury fitness club. To the wealthy patrons of Apex, David was entirely invisible. He was just the broad-shouldered, quiet man in the gray uniform who wiped down the imported Italian leather benches and fixed the state-of-the-art cryotherapy chambers. They didn't know that 8 years ago, David belonged to a classified Tier 1 counter-terrorism unit. They didn't know about the night raids in Kandahar, the hostage rescues in Somalia, or the medals sitting in a dusty shoebox beneath his bed. All they saw was the uniform, and that was exactly how David wanted it. When his wife, Sarah, passed away from ovarian cancer 3 years ago, David's world had collapsed. On her deathbed, he had held her frail hand and made a promise that rewrote his entire existence. "No more war, David," she had whispered, her breath shallow. "No more violence. Promise me you'll just be a father. Promise me Lily will never have to bury you." He had sworn it. He buried his tactical gear, walked away from a lucrative private security contract, and became a ghost. Now, his entire universe revolved around 7-year-old Lily. She was a bright, quiet girl with her mother's curly brown hair and her father's observant eyes. But Sarah's medical bills had left them drowning in a sea of debt, which was why David found himself scrubbing floors at Apex Summit. On a freezing Friday night in November, the Apex Summit was entirely transformed. The usual rows of treadmills had been cleared out to make way for a professional-grade fighting octagon. The air smelled of expensive cologne, catered caviar, and raw adrenaline. Tonight was the annual Brawl for a Cause, a high-profile charity gala hosted by Vicki Croft. Vicki Croft was not just a billionaire, she was an empire builder. At 42, she was the ruthless CEO of Croft Media Group, a conglomerate that owned everything from streaming platforms to international sports franchises. She was striking, impeccably dressed in a tailored white Tom Ford suit, watching the evening's proceedings from a VIP balcony with the cold, calculating eyes of a hawk assessing a field of field mice. She didn't care about the charity, an ambiguous foundation for inner-city youth. She cared about the optics, the live stream numbers, and protecting her biggest investment. That investment was currently standing in the center of the octagon, basking in the flash of cameras. Jackson the Ripper Stone was the reigning, undefeated light heavyweight MMA champion of the world. At 6'3" and 220 pounds of heavily tattooed, shredded muscle, Jackson was a physical specimen. He was also a notoriously arrogant, volatile bully. Croft Media had just signed him to a staggering $50 million promotional contract, banking on his bad boy image to drive pay-per-view sales. Jackson thrived on cruelty. He didn't just beat his opponents, he broke them mentally, mocking them in the cage, ruining their careers. Tonight, to entertain the billionaire donors and the 500,000 viewers watching on Croft's streaming platform, Jackson was taking on exhibition matches against local gym coaches and amateur fighters. David was stationed near the catering tables, a damp rag in his hand, keeping his head down. Beside him, sitting quietly on an overturned milk crate behind a velvet curtain, was Lily. His babysitter had bailed at the last minute, and David couldn't afford to lose this shift. His manager, a sweaty, nervous man named Greg, had reluctantly allowed Lily to stay out of sight, warning David that if the billionaire guests even saw the child, he'd be fired on the spot. Lily was happily coloring in a worn sketchbook, her small legs swinging. "Is it almost time to go home, Daddy?" she whispered, holding up a crude drawing of a superhero that looked suspiciously like David in his gray maintenance shirt. David knelt, wiping his clean hands on his trousers before tapping her nose. "Soon, sweetie. Let me just clean up this spill near the VIP section, and then we'll go get some ice cream. The cheap kind with the wooden spoons." Lily giggled, hiding her face behind the sketchbook. "I love the wooden spoons. Stay right here. Don't move," David instructed gently, his eyes scanning the raucous crowd. In the octagon, Jackson Stone had just brutally knocked out a local jiu-jitsu instructor. It was supposed to be a light spar, a charity exhibition, but Jackson had thrown a devastating spinning back kick that caught the amateur flush on the jaw. The crowd gasped, then erupted into applause as the medic rushed the cage. Vicky Croft leaned over the glass railing of her balcony, swirling a glass of scotch. She frowned slightly at the brutality, not out of empathy but out of legal concern, but the spike in the live stream viewers on the monitor beside her smoothed her features back into a satisfied smirk. Jackson was a monster, but he was her monster. Jackson grabbed the microphone from the announcer, his chest heaving, sweat gleaming on his tattooed shoulders. "Who's next?" he roared, playing to the cameras. "Come on!" I thought this city had tough guys. Who wants to step in here and earn 100 grand for their little charity? Anyone? Or are you all just a bunch of pampered cowards? The billionaire tech bros and hedge fund managers chuckled nervously, sipping their champagne. Nobody was stupid enough to get into the cage with a man who had just hospitalized a professional coach. Jackson jumped over the top of the cage, landing heavily on the plush carpet of the VIP floor. He was high on adrenaline, flanked by his entourage of sycophants and bodyguards. He began pacing the floor, pointing at random businessmen, mocking their suits, riling up the crowd. The cameras followed his every move, broadcasting his unchecked ego to the world. And then, in his pacing, Jackson backed up. He didn't look where he was going. He stepped right through the velvet curtain separating the VIP lounge from the service corridor. Right where Lily was sitting, Jackson's heavy, custom-made fighting barefoot brushed against the overturned milk crate. He stumbled slightly, looking down in annoyance. Lily, startled by the massive, sweating man suddenly invading her space, scrambled backward. In her panic, her elbow caught the edge of a catering cart. A silver tray holding 3 glasses of iced water tipped over. The water splashed directly onto Jackson's bare shins and splattered across his sponsor-branded warm-up pants. The music seemed to stop. The crowd nearest to the curtain went dead silent. The camera crew rushed over, their bright LED lights blinding the small girl. Jackson looked down at his wet pants, then down at the terrified 7-year-old girl clutching a sketchbook. His face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "What the hell is this?" Jackson barked, his voice echoing through the silent room. He kicked the milk crate viciously, sending it skidding across the floor and smashing into the wall. Lily let out a sharp cry, shrinking into a tight ball, trembling. David was 20 feet away, wiping a table, when he heard his daughter's cry. The rag dropped from his hand. His heart stopped. Before David could push through the crowd, Jackson reached down and snatched the sketchbook from Lily's hands. "Who brought a stray rat into my event?" Jackson sneered, holding the sketchbook up. He ripped a page out the drawing of David and crumpled it, throwing it at Lily. "I'm trying to put on a show, and I've got some trash kid spilling water on a $50,000 wardrobe. Hey!" The voice wasn't a shout, but it carried a baritone weight that cut through the murmurs of the elite crowd. David pushed through a group of hedge fund managers, his gray uniform starkly out of place against the sea of tuxedos and designer gowns. He didn't run. He walked with a terrifyingly calm, deliberate stride, placing himself immediately between Jackson and his trembling daughter. David knelt down, turning his back completely to the heavyweight champion of the world, a cardinal sin in the fighting world to pull Lily into his arms. "Are you okay, baby?" David whispered, checking her face. Lily buried her face in his neck, sobbing quietly. Jackson stared at the maintenance man's back, his ego flaring at the absolute disrespect. "Hey, janitor," Jackson spat. "Is this your mess?" David slowly stood up. He kept Lily tucked securely behind his leg. He looked at Jackson. There was no fear in David's eyes, no awe of the celebrity standing before him. There was only the exhausted patience of a father trying to keep a promise to his dead wife. "I apologize for the spill, Mr. Stone," David said, his voice even and respectful. "She got scared. It was an accident. I'll clean the floor and we'll leave." Jackson laughed, a harsh, barking sound. His entourage immediately joined in, chuckling on cue. "You'll clean it? You think you scrubbing the floor fixes this? Do you know who I am, you minimum wage loser? You think your apology means anything to me?" Up on the balcony, Vicky Croft leaned forward, resting her chin on her hands. This was unscripted, unplanned, but the live stream chat was exploding. Who is this guy? Jackson is gonna kill him. The counter ticked past 1 million concurrent viewers. Vicky gestured to her producers on the floor. Keep the cameras rolling. Do not cut away. Greg, the sweaty facility manager, frantically pushed his way to the front. Mr. Stone, I am so sorry. He's just a cleaner. Cole, grab your kid and get the hell out of here. You're fired. I'm so sorry, Jackson, please. Shut up, Greg, Jackson snapped, never taking his eyes off David. The fighter stepped closer, invading David's personal space. He poked a thick, taped finger hard into David's chest. You're not going anywhere, floor boy. You disrespected me. Your little brat ruined my gear. You owe me. David didn't flinch at the poke. His breathing remained slow, rhythmic. In his mind, he heard Sarah's voice. No more violence, David. I lost my job, David said quietly. I have nothing to give you. Please, just let me take my daughter home. Oh, look at this, Jackson mocked, turning to the cameras, his arms spread wide. The tough guy wants to run home. He wants to cry poverty. The crowd of millionaires chuckled softly. They were insulated, safe in their wealth, enjoying the humiliation of a working-class man as if it were a theatrical performance. Jackson turned back to David, his eyes gleaming with malicious intent. Tell you what, janitor, I'm a generous guy. I'm a charitable guy. You see that cage? Jackson pointed to the octagon. You get in there with me for 60 seconds. You survive 1 minute, I'll tell Greg to give you your pathetic job back. Hell, I'll even throw 10 grand into your bank account so you can buy your kid some decent clothes. She looks like a street urchin. The crowd oohed and awed at the insult. David's jaw tightened. A muscle jumped in his cheek. He looked down at Lily. Her shoes were scuffed, her jacket bought from a thrift store. $10,000 would pay off the last of Sarah's hospital bills. It would mean heating the apartment without checking the meter. It would mean groceries that weren't from a discount bin. But stepping into that cage meant breaking his promise. No, David said, his voice tight. I don't fight. Jackson's smirk vanished. Being told no in front of 1 million live viewers was unacceptable. The fighter took a half step forward and deliberately brought his heel down on Lily's fallen sketchbook, grinding the cheap paper and crayons into the carpet. You don't fight? Jackson hissed, dropping his voice so only David and the cameras could hear. Then you're a coward. You're a pathetic excuse for a man and a pathetic excuse for a father. If you walk out that door, I promise you, I'll make sure you never get a job in this city again. I'll make sure you and your brat starve. Up on the balcony, even Vicky Croft felt a brief flicker of distaste. Jackson was going too far. Bullying an amateur fighter was one thing. Threatening a single father in front of his crying child was a PR nightmare waiting to happen. She reached for her radio to tell security to separate them. But before she could press the button, David moved. He didn't strike Jackson. He didn't yell. He simply turned to Lily. He knelt down, completely ignoring the enraged fighter towering over him. Lily, David said softly, wiping a tear from her cheek with his rough thumb. Do you remember the game we play when there's thunder? Lily sniffled, nodding slowly. Close my eyes and count to 10. That's right, sweetheart. I need you to close your eyes, cover your ears, and count to 10. I'm going to go make sure the thunder stops. Can you do that for Daddy? Okay, she whispered, squeezing her eyes shut and pressing her small hands over her ears. David stood up. The hunched, exhausted posture of a beaten-down maintenance man was gone. He rolled his shoulders backward, his spine straightened. In that singular microsecond, the ghost shed its disguise. He looked at Jackson. The warmth and patience in David's eyes had vanished, replaced by an abyssal, terrifying emptiness. It was the look of a man who had stared into the darkest corners of human nature and was preparing to go back there. 60 seconds, David said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a chilling resonance. Let's go. The crowd erupted into a mix of cheers, laughter, and mocking applause. They were eager for blood, a gladiator match between a god and a peasant. Jackson grinned, showing his mouthpiece, and jogged toward the octagon, hyping up the crowd, shadow boxing for the cameras. David didn't jog. He walked. He didn't take off his gray maintenance shirt. He didn't remove his cheap, steel-toed work boots. He simply stepped through the cage door, the metal hinges squeaking softly behind him. The referee, a seasoned MMA official hired for the night, looked at David with genuine pity. "Listen, buddy," the ref whispered, stepping close to David. "Just fall down. Take a jab to the shoulder, go down, and stay down. I'll wave it off immediately. Don't let him kill you." David looked through the referee as if he were made of glass. His eyes were locked on Jackson. "One," Lily whispered softly outside the cage, her eyes tightly shut, hands over her ears. Vicky Croft stood up from her leather chair on the balcony. She walked to the absolute edge of the glass. Something was wrong. Her billionaire intuition, the instinct that had built an empire, was screaming at her. She studied the maintenance man on the monitor. Every amateur fighter, every victim Jackson had ever pulled into the cage, did the same thing. They bounced. They held their hands up too high, their breathing erratic, their eyes wide with the adrenaline dump of facing a killer. David Cole was completely motionless. His hands rested loosely at his sides. His breathing was so shallow his chest barely moved. He stood perfectly bladed, his center of gravity flawlessly balanced. It wasn't the stance of a sportsman. It was the stance of an executioner. "Ring the bell!" Jackson screamed, pounding his chest. "2," Lily counted. Ding, ding. Jackson didn't bother touching gloves. He wanted a highlight reel knockout. He launched himself across the octagon with terrifying, explosive speed, closing the distance in a fraction of a second. He threw a devastating overhand right, a punch that had rendered professional fighters unconscious for minutes at a time. It was aimed directly at David's temple, thrown with the full intent to cause severe brain trauma. "3," Lily whispered. The crowd drew a collective breath. David didn't block. Blocking transferred kinetic energy into the defender's body. David simply wasn't there. With a movement so fluid and impossibly fast that the cameras barely caught it, David pivoted his lead foot by 3 inches. He slipped his head to the outside of the massive punch, letting Jackson's fist cut through empty air, mere millimeters from his ear. Jackson's momentum carried him forward, totally overextended, exposing his ribs. The ghost struck. David didn't throw a wide, looping punch. He didn't wind up. He used a close-quarters combat technique designed for lethal military encounters. His left hand shot upward, an open palm strike that slammed directly into the radial nerve of Jackson's extending arm, instantly deadening the limb. Before Jackson's brain could even register the shock, David's right fist drove upward like a piston. He didn't aim for the jaw. He aimed for the liver. Crack. The sound echoed through the silent ballroom like a gunshot. It was the sickening thud of knuckles sinking deep into unprotected flesh, perfectly placed beneath the floating rib. A liver strike is biologically unignorable. It causes an instantaneous, catastrophic shutdown of the nervous system. A professional fighter can take a punch to the face and keep fighting on instinct. But a perfect liver shot causes the body's blood pressure to plummet instantly. The brain forcibly paralyzes the legs to protect the organ. Jackson's eyes went impossibly wide. The arrogance vanished, replaced by primal, screaming agony. His mouth opened, but no sound came out because his diaphragm had seized. He was already falling, but David wasn't finished. As Jackson crumpled forward, gasping for air that wouldn't come, David stepped into the collapsing fighter. He placed his left hand on the back of Jackson's neck, guiding the falling champion's face downward, and brought his right knee up in a short, brutal, perfectly calculated strike. It wasn't a knee meant to kill. It was a knee meant to turn off the lights. It connected flush with the point of Jackson's chin. Jackson, the Ripperstone, the undefeated, untouchable $50 million titan of the MMA world, hit the canvas completely unconscious before his knees even touched the mat. His body bounced once, then lay entirely still, his arms splayed out in a fencing response. The clock on the digital scoreboard above the cage stopped. Linder Lin Arfin Ba. Less than 3 seconds. The silence in the apex summit was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating vacuum. The billionaires weren't laughing. The camera crews were frozen. Even the referee stood paralyzed, his mouth hanging open, staring at the motionless body of the champion. David didn't celebrate. He didn't look at the cameras, and he didn't look at the crowd. His breathing hadn't elevated. His expression hadn't changed. He casually stepped over the unconscious body of the man who had threatened to starve his daughter. He pushed the cage door open. It squeaked again. That tiny metallic sound was the only noise in a room holding 500 people. David walked out of the cage, crossed the VIP floor, and stopped where Lily was sitting. 10, Lily whispered, opening her eyes and dropping her hands. She looked up at her father. Is the thunder gone, Daddy? David offered her a gentle, tired smile. The cold killer was instantly gone, replaced once more by the weary mechanic. Yeah, baby, the thunder is gone. Come on, let's go get that ice cream. He reached down, picked up the torn, crumpled drawing of himself, tucked it carefully into his pocket, and took his daughter's small hand. Without a single glance backward, David Cole walked out of the Apex Summit, the sea of stunned, silent millionaires, parting for him as if he were parting the Red Sea. Up on the balcony, Vicky Croft was gripping the glass railing so tightly her knuckles were stark white. Her perfectly curated world had just been shattered. She stared at the unconscious body of her prize fighter, then snapped her gaze to the retreating back of the man in the gray uniform. The live stream chat on her monitor wasn't just spiking, it had completely broken the server. Millions of people had just watched a literal nobody dismantle the most dangerous man on the planet in less time than it takes to take a breath. Vicky turned to her head of security, a hulking ex-Mossad agent who was currently staring open-mouthed at the ring. I want to know who that man is, Vicky commanded, her voice trembling with a mixture of absolute fury and undeniable awe. I want his name, his background, his military records, everything. Do not let him disappear. But David Cole was already gone into the Seattle rain, completely unaware that his 3 seconds of violence had just put a target on his back from the most powerful woman in the country. By sunrise on Saturday morning, the world had fundamentally shifted. The 3-second clip of a man in a gray maintenance uniform rendering the most dangerous fighter on the planet entirely comatose had broken the internet. It was a digital wildfire. On X, formerly Twitter, the hashtag number #TheGhostJanitor was trending at #1 globally. ESPN anchors were replaying the footage frame by frame, completely baffled by the clinical precision of the liver strike and the devastating knee. Combat sports analysts on massive platforms, from Joe Rogan to Pat McAfee, were dissecting the footwork, universally agreeing on one terrifying fact: the maintenance man was not an amateur. That level of economy of motion only came from someone who had fought for their life in environments where there were no referees. In her penthouse suite overlooking the Seattle skyline, Vicky Croft was not sleeping. She stood in a silk robe, staring at the multi-screen array on her office wall. Every channel, every feed, every social media metric was screaming the same story. Jackson Stone's carefully cultivated aura of invincibility was completely shattered. He wasn't a god anymore. He was a meme. Her head of security, an imposing British man named Thomas, walked into the office carrying a sleek tablet. He looked exhausted, having spent the last 8 hours pulling every string and calling every contact in Washington, D.C. to bypass federal encryption walls. We found him, Miss Croft, Thomas said, his voice unusually hushed. He placed the tablet on her glass desk, and I strongly suggest we tread carefully. Vicky leaned over, her sharp eyes scanning the digital file. The photograph showed a younger, harder version of the man from the club. David Cole, Thomas narrated, 36, widowed 3 years ago, father of 1. He works at a local auto repair shop during the day and took the Apex Summit job 6 months ago to pay off a staggering mountain of medical debt left by his late wife's cancer treatments. Vicky frowned. That explains the poverty. It doesn't explain how he dismantled a $50 million professional athlete in under 3 seconds. Scroll down to his military service, ma'am. Vicky swiped the screen. The majority of the page was completely blacked out with heavy redaction blocks, but the visible text was enough to make her breath catch. United States Army. 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta. Delta Force, Thomas confirmed, his tone respectful. Tier 1 Counterterrorism. But it gets deeper. He wasn't just an operator. He was a close-quarters combat instructor for classified extraction units. Multiple deployments to Syria, Afghanistan, and places that don't exist on paper. 2 Silver Stars. He was honorably discharged right around the time his wife got sick. The man is a lethal weapon who put himself on a shelf to be a father. Vicky leaned back, a cold, calculating smile slowly spreading across her face. The PR crisis of losing her undefeated champion was evaporating, replaced by the scent of an unprecedented opportunity. Jackson Stone was a loudmouth bully whose marketability was now dead. But David Cole? A humble, grieving war hero pushed too far by a wealthy tyrant, stepping up to protect his little girl? It was the greatest underdog story of the decade. Jackson is a liability, Vicky said softly, her billionaire instincts taking full control. His sponsors are already threatening to pull out because of how he treated the child before the fight. We are dropping him, Thomas. Thomas shifted uncomfortably. There's a complication with that, ma'am. Jackson discharged himself from the hospital an hour ago against medical advice. He has a severe concussion, but he is completely unhinged. He feels humiliated. My contacts on the street are telling me he just pulled $50,000 in cash and hired 3 enforcers from a local syndicate. Vicky's eyes narrowed. What is he doing? He's not going back to the cage, Miss Croft. Jackson knows his career is over. He wants blood. He's going to David Cole's auto shop right now. He intends to cripple him. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. Vicky grabbed her phone. Get the SUVs ready. Now, if Jackson touches that man or his daughter, Croft Media will be implicated in a criminal conspiracy. Plus, Jackson is severely underestimating who he is dealing with. I want to be there to clean this up. 30 blocks away, the heavy Seattle rain beat down on the corrugated tin roof of Miller's Auto Repair. It was Saturday and the shop was closed, but David was underneath a rusted Ford pickup, a wrench in his hand, trying to earn a little under-the-table cash to replace the job he had just lost. In the small, glass-walled office in the corner of the garage, Lily was sitting on a swivel chair, wearing oversized noise-canceling headphones, happily watching cartoons on a battered iPad. David tightened a bolt, his muscles aching. He had known the video would get out, but he hadn't cared. He only cared that Lily was safe and that the hospital billing department wouldn't call on Monday. The loud metal screech of the garage's side door being kicked open shattered the peace. David slid out from under the truck on his creeper board, wiping the grease from his hands with a red rag. Standing in the doorway, soaked in rain and seething with a murderous rage, was Jackson Stone. His jaw was heavily bruised, his eyes bloodshot and erratic. Flanking him were 3 massive men's street muscle, wearing heavy leather jackets and carrying steel batons and brass knuckles. They weren't there for a fair fight. They were there to end a life. Jackson spat on the oil-stained concrete. "You thought you could just walk away, janitor?" He slurred slightly, the effects of the concussion evident in his speech. "You thought you could ruin my life and go back to fixing cars? I'm going to break both of your legs, and then I'm going to make you watch while we trash this place with your kid inside." At the mention of Lily, the atmospheric pressure in the garage changed. David stood up slowly. He dropped the red rag onto a workbench. He glanced at the glass office. Lily was oblivious, her back to them, laughing at her cartoon. When David turned back to the 4 men, the tired mechanic was entirely gone. The ghost was back. "I made a promise to my wife that I was done with violence," David said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. "It wasn't a threat. It was a simple statement of fact. But she isn't here right now. And my daughter is... I am going to give you 3 seconds to walk out that door." Jackson laughed, a manic, desperate sound. "Get him!" he screamed to his hired muscle. The 3 enforcers rushed forward. They expected a brawler. They expected a man who would trade punches. They had no comprehension of Tier 1 military kinetics. The first man swung a steel baton at David's head. David didn't step back. He stepped inside the arc of the weapon, neutralizing its momentum. He trapped the man's arm, twisted it until the elbow popped with a sickening crunch, and drove the palm of his hand up under the man's chin. The enforcer's eyes rolled back, and he hit the floor like a sack of cement. The second man lunged with brass knuckles. David deflected the heavy punch with his forearm, pivoted behind the man, and swept his legs out from under him. As the man fell, David delivered a single, focused heel strike to the side of the man's knee. The joint gave way with a loud snap, and the man screamed, clutching his leg in agony. The third man hesitated, terror suddenly washing over his face. He dropped his baton and turned to run. David let him go. It had taken less than 5 seconds. Jackson stood alone, his chest heaving, his hired thugs neutralized instantly. The reality of his situation pierced through his concussion. He wasn't fighting an amateur. He had walked into a slaughterhouse, and the butcher was staring right at him. David picked up a heavy steel lug wrench from the workbench and took a slow step toward Jackson. The fighter stumbled backward, tripping over an air hose and falling hard onto the wet concrete. "Wait!" Jackson begged, holding his hands up, tears of pure terror mixing with the rain on his face. "Wait, please, man. I'm sorry. I have money. I can pay you." "I don't want your money," David said, his voice like grinding stone. He stood over Jackson, the wrench gripped tightly. Suddenly, the screech of tires echoed outside. The blinding glare of LED headlights flooded the garage. 3 black SUVs slammed into park in the alleyway. Doors flew open, and Thomas, along with 4 armed private security contractors, rushed into the garage, their weapons drawn, and aimed squarely at Jackson. Vicky Croft stepped out of the center vehicle, holding an umbrella, stepping gingerly over the puddles in her designer heels. She looked at the groveling, terrified Jackson on the floor, then at the 2 unconscious enforcers, and finally at David, who hadn't even flinched at the arrival of armed men. "Mr. Cole," Vicky said, her voice cutting through the heavy tension, "I apologize for the intrusion. Please, put the wrench down. He isn't worth the paperwork." David stared at her for a long moment, then casually tossed the wrench onto a nearby table. It clanged loudly. Vicky looked down at Jackson with absolute disgust. "Jackson Stone, as of this exact second, Croft Media is terminating your $50 million contract under the moral turpitude and criminal conduct clauses. You are bankrupt. Furthermore, my security team has recorded your arrival here with armed felons. If you ever come within 50 miles of Mr. Cole or his daughter again, I will personally fund the district attorney's campaign to ensure you spend the rest of your natural life in a maximum security prison." Jackson sobbed, a pathetic, broken sound. Thomas signaled his men, who hauled the disgraced fighter to his feet and dragged him out into the alley, tossing him into the rain like garbage. Vicky turned her attention back to David. The cold corporate shark faded, replaced by something resembling genuine respect. "I know who you are, David," Vicky said softly. "I know what you did for this country, and I know what you gave up for your daughter. What happened at my club was an unforgivable failure of my staff. I am here to make it right." David crossed his arms, his posture guarded. "I don't need charity, Miss Croft." "I don't offer charity," Vicky replied smoothly. "I offer business. My executive protection team is severely lacking in real-world tactical leadership. I need a director of global security. The starting salary is 7 figures, full medical coverage for you and your daughter, and a fully funded private education trust for Lily." David blinked, the defensive wall around him cracking just a fraction. He looked toward the glass office. Lily had taken off her headphones and was pressing her face against the glass, waving happily at him. "No more scrubbing floors," Vicky pressed, her voice gentle. "No more running from debt. You protect my assets during the day, and you go home to your little girl every single night. That is my offer." David looked at his grease-stained hands. He thought of the empty refrigerator, the stack of final notice bills on his counter, and the promise he had made to Sarah to take care of their little girl. He wasn't going back to war. He was finally bringing the war to an end. David looked back at Vicky, his eyes clear and resolute. "I drop her off at school at 8. I pick her up at 3. My schedule revolves around her, not you." Vicky smiled, extending a manicured hand. "I wouldn't expect anything less, Mr. Cole. Welcome to Croft Media." David shook her hand. The invisible man was gone forever, replaced by a father who had fought the darkness, protected his light, and finally won. Did this story of a father's ultimate sacrifice and brutal karma send chills down your spine? Sometimes the quietest men in the room are the ones you should fear the most. And real heroes don't wear capes, they wear faded work boots. If David and Lily's incredible journey of justice and vindication inspired you, hit that like button, share this story with someone who loves a hard-hitting comeback, and subscribe for more epic real-life drama.